Think about the last time you told yourself this week, I'm going to work out consistently, or I'm going to stop checking my phone the moment I wake up, or I'm going to be more patient with my kids at the end of a long day, or I'm finally going to stop saying yes to everything and protect my time. You meant it. You really did. You might have even made a plan. And then life happened. The week got busy, the old patterns crept back in, and somewhere in the back of your mind, a quiet voice whispered, why can't I just do it? What is wrong with me? Nothing is wrong with you. And today's episode is my attempt to prove that to you with science, with story, and with some tools that actually work. Because knowing what you should do and actually changing your behavior, those are two completely different things. And most of us were never taught why. Welcome to Success Reimagined. I am Dr. Amna Shabir, your host on this journey to thrive at the intersection of ambition and wellness. In every episode, I'll help you challenge outdated definitions of success, discover practical tools and strategies for growth without compromising your well being. I am so glad you've joined me. Let's reimagine what's possible together. Today, we're diving into something I talk about a lot with my clients. And I talk about this whether I'm standing on stage, working in a group setting, or one on one. It keeps coming back constantly. And that is something we genuinely misunderstand: behavior change. Why is it so hard? Why do we know what to do and still not do it? And what does the latest mind body science tell us about how to actually make change stick? By the end of this episode, you are going to understand the real mechanics of why change feels impossible. And you're going to walk away with actual tools that you can start using today. Let's get into it. Let's start with the science, because there is a model. It's been around since the 1990s. It is one of the most validated frameworks in behavioral psychology, and yet most people have never heard of it. It's called the trans-theoretical model of change, developed by psychologists Percheska and D. Clemente. And it changed how I think about everything when it comes to behavior change. Here's the core idea: change is not an event, and it's a process that happens in stages. There are 6 stages of behavior change, and I'm going to go through each one of them, explaining them in detail. The first stage is pre-contemplation. This is where someone doesn't even see a problem yet. They're not thinking about changing. Maybe it's someone who genuinely doesn't realize their stress levels are unsustainable, or who has normalized their exhaustion so completely that it just feels like life. And if you're in this stage, you're not going to respond to advice. You're going to feel judged and you're going to shut down. This is why nagging never works, and why so many well-intentioned doctors also leave their patients feeling worse, not better. This is the stage of pre-contemplation, the first stage. The second stage is contemplation. This is, I know I should change stage. Sound familiar? This is where most of us actually live. You know you should exercise more, drink less, set better boundaries, prioritize sleep. You think about it a lot, but you haven't taken action yet. And here's what's important: this stage can last a long time, months, years. That doesn't mean you're failing, it means you're processing. Ambivalence is normal, healthy part of change. The problem is when we treat contemplation like it's a character flaw. So if you've already started thinking about change and you're contemplating change, congratulations, you're already in stage 2. The third stage is preparation. Now you're getting ready, you're researching. You've told a friend you want to start running or going to the gym. You've brought that journal, you downloaded the app, you set your alarm. This is exciting, but also where a lot of people stall, because preparation can become a way to feel productive without actually taking the leap. The fourth stage of change is action. This is a stage all the books, all the apps, and all the just do it advice is aimed at. You're actively changing the behavior. Here's the thing: action is not beginning of change. Action stage is actually the fourth stage of change, as you can see, which means if you've been wondering why all the productivity advice hasn't worked for you, it is because it is focused for the fourth stage, not the first stage. And when you get action stage tools, you're actually in contemplation. That's the second stage. That is going to not land at all. It's a massive oversight. The fifth stage of change is maintenance. Now you've made the change and you're sustaining it. This requires a completely different skill set than taking action in the first place. It's about building identity, environment design, and being resilient to setbacks. Now we'll go to the sixth stage of change, which is often labeled as either termination or relapse. This is when the change has become so integrated, it no longer requires an effort. Think of someone who has been sober for 20 years and simply doesn't think of themselves as a drinker anymore, or there's a relapse, a slip back to an earlier stage. And here's what the research tells us about relapse: that it's not failure, it's actually data. Most people cycle through stages. That's why these are called the stages of change. And people cycle through them multiple times before a change fully sticks. So this is not weakness. This is how being human works. The sixth stage of change, I'll also add as a disclaimer, a lot of people don't formally recognize it, but enough literature talks about it that I wanted to mention it. So again, in summary, there are 6 stages of change. Stage 1, pre-contemplation. Stage 2, contemplation. Stage 3, preparation. Stage 4, action. Stage 5, maintenance. And stage 6, which is termination/relapse. Let me take you to a moment where I was working with a client of mine, and the topic that we were actively working on was setting boundaries. This was a high achieving client. They knew themselves for years that they needed to set boundaries surrounding work. They contemplated it constantly, so they were on stage 2. They could articulate the cost of not doing it, and they had researched surrounding that, and this is where they had come to me. This had led to the journey had led to me. And so they were sort of also in the stage 3 preparation when they reached out to me, but they never acted. What finally moved them into this preparation/action phase was getting clear in detail, having that resource that I was for them and sitting with them and actually going through the pros and cons and then coming up with extremely concrete, simple action plan to actually go and set the boundaries. So it had to be taken from that big task to make it very simple and implementable. And the biggest part was, when we talk about setting boundaries, for example, in this case, in their mind, they had this image that you're going to actually take a fence and a picket axe and actually go and put a boundary surrounding people. They had to announce this to the whole world that now they were setting boundaries, when actually it all starts with a small mindset shift. It starts in your brain and it goes from there. So getting very clear helped them move from the stage 2, which was contemplation, to preparation, to action, and to maintenance. And yes, relapses still happen, but they're able to get right back up and able to keep going. Okay, let's talk about why change is hard. Now that you know about the 6 stages of change, you understand the map. I want to go a layer deeper because I think understanding the neuroscience here is genuinely liberating. When you know why your brain resists change, you stop taking it so personally. So the first reason is that our brains are wired for efficiency, not growth. Here's what's happening in your brain every time you try to change a habit. There are structures deep in the brain, including parts of the basal ganglia, that are heavily involved in automating behavior and in the shift from effortful, goal-directed actions to more automatic, habit-like responding. Every time you repeat something, a thought, an action, a routine, your brain strengthens that your brain strengthens that pattern. Automation is efficient. It frees up your prefrontal cortex, which is your thinking brain, for new challenges. The problem is that this system doesn't distinguish between good and bad habits. Reaching for your phone first thing in the morning and meditating first thing in the morning are both encoded as familiar patterns. Changing a well-learned pattern takes more effort and can feel uncomfortable or even threatening, especially when you're tired or stressed. That friction is not a sign you're doing it wrong. It is your nervous system doing what it's designed to do: prefer familiar and efficient. So that's the first reason. The second reason why change feels so hard is because shame sort of shuts down our change circuitry. From a brain perspective, shame and self-criticism activate your threat system that includes regions like the amygdala. They ramp up your stress physiology. Under high stress, prefrontal functions like planning, flexible thinking, and self-control are harder to access. So shame doesn't create change, it creates a state where change is harder. And then there's reason number 3. That's your motivational triad working against you. The idea is this: your primitive brain, the part of your brain that is built for survival, is driven by 3 core motivators: seek pleasure, avoid pain, and conserve energy. That's the motivational triad. And it makes perfect sense 100,000 years ago when pleasure meant calories, pain meant predators, and conserving energy was literally the difference between survival and death. The problem is that most meaningful behavior change asks you to do the exact opposite of all of these 3, right? Exercise, short term pain, energy expenditure, and delayed gratification. Sitting with a difficult emotion instead of scrolling on your phone, you're choosing discomfort over the instant dopamine hit of scrolling. Having a hard conversation instead of avoiding it, your brain registers that as threat and cost. Your primitive brain is not obstructing your progress out of malice, it is just doing its job. The work of behavior change is learning to work with that wiring, not shame yourself for having it. And the fourth reason I want to add over here is ambivalence is not weakness. This is something I wish every person who has tried to change something about themselves could hear. That ambivalence is normal. Wanting to change and not wanting to change at the same time. That's not confusion, that's human. Every change involves loss, even positive change. For example, giving up drinking might mean giving up a social ritual. Leaving a job might mean giving up security. Starting to exercise might mean giving up time. Your resistance, it's not irrational. It's again your nervous system accounting for the full cost of change. The goal is not to eliminate ambivalence. The goal is to work with it. Okay, I'm going to share a bit of a personal story when it comes to change and something that I struggled with for a very long time. Now, as you all know that I am a dual board certified physician, that means I know. I know what happens to your body when you don't take care of it. I have studied the evidence. I also am certified in behavior change. So I know what all of this is. And yet I struggled for many years with having a healthy relationship with movement. I think personally, perfectionism had a lot to play with it, and I'll touch on that in a little bit. But when it came to having a healthy weight, healthy movement, and actually a good experience with eating and body image, I really struggled with all of that pretty much my whole life. And I really don't even, I still, as I'm talking about it, I'm getting uncomfortable because I feel awkward talking about it openly. So I'm trying to practice what I preach and show up and share honestly and authentically with you. So between having disordered eating, not wanting to move my body, and struggling with a lot of body image issues and shame surrounding it, the real shift for me started happening when I truly recognized what change was, what it meant, and I stopped shaming myself, making small changes and small plans. Again, I didn't do it all on my own. I'm so grateful to my coaches, my personal trainer who helped me make that change, recognizing where I was in those 6 stages of change, and then breaking things down and making them clear and working with the resistance that I was having, not against it. And now I can proudly say that it has been about 3 years that I've been consistently going to the gym, working out, and having a much healthier relationship with my body. I lost a significant amount of weight over a span of 6 to 7 years. And again, this is not to say that a certain BMI, I mean, I hate the term BMI, is better than another, but it is about having a healthier relationship with yourself that includes your physical self. Okay, now I'm touched on perfectionism when it came to my personal story. So as you know, that as someone who studies perfectionism and is really drawn to that topic, I'm going to double click and talk about perfectionism and behavior change in specific. And this is really pertinent and relevant to many of you in the audience because I know that you struggle with perfectionism as a high achiever. Perfectionism often wears the disguise of a virtue. We talk about it like it's a strength. I have high standards, or I don't do things halfway, or I can't do it right. I would rather not do it at all, which was a lot of mentality that I carried That's the last sentence. If I can't do it right, if I can't go and work out for 3 hours, I'm just not going to. And that's where perfectionism quietly kills your behavior change plans. So here's what the research shows. When researchers look at perfectionism across large groups of people, they consistently find that certain forms of perfectionism are linked to more anxiety, more depression, more obsessive rigid thinking, not less. In other words, perfectionism isn't just a cute personality quirk, it's strongly associated with emotional distress, which makes behavior change harder to sustain. They also distinguish between two broad patterns. One is having high standards and taking pride in doing things well. That can support healthy striving when it's flexible. The other is more rigid, self critical version where your worth depends on your performance. You think in all or nothing terms, and any slip feels like a total failure. That second pattern is the one that really interferes with change. It's linked with more procrastination, more avoidance, and more giving up when things aren't perfect. I just talked a little bit about the all or nothing trap. Here's how it plays out in real life. You decide you're going to exercise for 5 days a week. You manage 3. And instead of thinking, I did 3 days, that's 3 more than 0, your brain says, I failed. I didn't do what I said I would do. And because that feels intolerable to a perfectionist, you either double down with an even more rigid plan or you give up entirely. Both responses are driven by the same thing, the belief that imperfect action is equivalent to failure. Studies on health behavior show that small, repeated actions over time are far more predictive of long-term change than short periods of intense effort. Perfectionism pushes you toward the opposite pattern. Let's talk about how perfectionism impacts the stages of change. Perfectionism also warps how we move through these stages. Many high achievers get stuck in overthinking, overplanning, waiting for the perfect plan before taking a first step. And when they inevitably slip, because we're human, we're all going to slip, they interpret it not as I had a hard week, but as I'm someone who fails. That shame response makes it much harder to get back into action. Here's what I have to offer when it comes to perfectionism and thinking about change: self-compassion. Self-compassion, not criticism, a lot of self-compassion. Self-compassion, not self-criticism, shows up again and again in the research as a buffer against perfectionism's most harmful effects. People who can talk to themselves kindly when they fall short are less likely to spiral into anxiety and more likely to try again. That's not softness, that's a practical, evidence-informed strategy for making change possible. Now, let's talk about some of the somatic tools that you can actually use for behavior change. And here's when it really gets interesting. Everything I've described so far, the brain's resistance, the nervous system threat response, the shame spiral, all of that is happening in your body, not just your mind. And that means we need body-based tools to work with. This is where somatic practices can be so powerful. And I know that when I use the term somatic-based practices or body-based practices, some of you might be having an instant reaction to it. You're thinking this is woo stuff. So please exhale. Don't worry, I'm not going to be selling you anything weird here. The term somatic comes from the Greek word for body, and it refers to practices that use the body as a resource for healing, regulation, and change. And the research on this is fascinating. When we engage the body directly, we can shift the nervous system state in a way that purely cognitive approaches simply can't. Thinking your way to change has real limits. We know that. Feeling your way to change, that's where a lot of transformation can happen. So I'm going to share 3 tools. The first tool is the body check-in, listening to resistance as information, basically. Here's the practice. The next time you notice yourself avoiding a change you've committed to, whether it's the workout, the difficult conversation, the morning routine, instead of pushing through or beating yourself up, pause. Close your eyes if you can. Take one breath and ask your body, where do I feel this resistance? Where is it living right now? Maybe it's a tightening in your chest, a heaviness in your shoulders, a kind of flatness or fog in your head. Don't try to fix it. Just notice it. Get curious. What is this sensation telling me? Is this fear, exhaustion, grief, something I haven't named yet. This practice does two things. First, it moves you out of shame into curiosity, which immediately shifts your brain state. Second, it treats your body's resistance as intelligent information rather than an obstacle to overcome. And often, when we actually listen to what resistance is saying, we find something important, something that needed to be heard before the change could happen. The second tool is the physiological sigh, which is regulating before acting. This tool is pretty quick and evidence-based. It's one of the fastest ways to activate your parasympathetic nervous system, which is your rest and digest state. And it brings your prefrontal cortex back online. Here's how it works. Take a normal inhale through your nose. Then before you exhale, take one more short sniff, topping off your lungs. Then let it all slowly through your mouth. That double inhale fully inflates your lungs, and the long exhale activates your vagus nerve, slowing your heart rate almost immediately. That's how it would sound. Now you can try it out right now. Inhale through your nose, have a little top up sniff, and slowly exhale through your mouth. This is your go-to tool for the moment before you need to take an action that your nervous system is resisting, before the workout, before the hard conversation, before the moment you would have usually reached out for your phone, for the carbohydrates that were not on your daily plan. Reset first and then act. The last tool that I want to share is about connecting your desired change to something that lives in your body, not just in your head. Because here's what I've noticed. We often make commitments from our logical brain. I should exercise because it's good for my health. That's true, but it's abstract if it doesn't light anything up. So here is the practice. Think about the change you want to make. Now ask yourself, why does this change matter to me really? This is your values body bridge. Go deeper than your obvious answer. Why does this change matter to me really? And then, what does it feel like in your body when you imagine having made this change? When you imagine being the person who has already done this? Where do you feel that in your body? Maybe it's a warmth in your chest, a kind of expansion, a sense of ease. That felt sense, that's your values made physical. And when you practice returning to that sensation before taking action, you're anchoring your behavior change not just to a goal, but to an embodied identity. And that's what makes it stick. Let me give you an example of using one of these techniques with a client that I was working with. So we're talking about these mind body techniques, and my client was struggling surrounding confident communication and self advocacy. They really struggled to speak up for themselves during meetings, and when they were in meetings, they felt like they're an imposter. So every time they rehearsed the conversation mentally, they felt ready, but every time the actual moment came, despite preparation, they felt that their throat would tighten, their chest would tighten. They would just have this like rushed feeling, like just rush, pressury feeling. So then they would either not talk, or when they would talk a lot and then instantly feel, oh my goodness, I think I've said too much. Using just the simple body check-in and taking a moment before actually speaking and pausing, this created that little bridge that they just needed in the moment to go back into their parasympathetic state, just noticing how their body was reacting and responding in the moment. And then they were able to make better decisions. Okay. I want to take a moment at this point to address something that I don't think gets talked about enough in this space, and that is causing real harm. That is the so-called wellness influencer culture. And I'm not approaching this conversation from some proverbial high horse, but from the space of being a physician who is dual board certified and is a behavior change expert, and who is really conscientious on the conversations that I have and the advice that I give. As you know, that I talk about perfectionism. And so there is a lot of harm that is coming from these really prescriptive narratives of wellness that are being shoved down our throats. So what is actually happening is essentially gaslighting by the very people that are promising to help you. Let me ground this in what we are seeing broadly in the research. Social media use on its own is one thing, but repeated exposure to appearance focused, comparison heavy wellness content is consistently linked with higher levels of depression, anxiety, body dissatisfaction, and disordered eating. In other words, it's not just being online that's the issue, it's the kind of content you're bathing your nervous system in. Emerging studies suggest that when you're repeatedly exposed to appearance focused wellness and weight loss content, you're more likely to experience harmful social comparison, feel worse about your body, and engage in more extreme or disordered eating patterns above and beyond just time spent on social media. It's the emphasis on aesthetics, perfection, and constant self optimization that does the damage. There's also growing work looking at influencers themselves. Many of them report high levels of stress and burnout, which makes sense when your body, your lifestyle, and your before and after are basically your business model. That pressure can shape the content they create, pushing them towards more extreme claims, more rigid rules, and more curated images just to stay visible and relevant. So, what does wellness gaslighting actually look like? You follow someone who promises their protocol, their meal plan, their morning routine will transform your life. You try it, it doesn't work, or it works briefly and then it stops, or it only works at an enormous personal cost. And somewhere in their content, explicitly or implicitly, the message is if it didn't work, you didn't do it right. You weren't consistent enough. You didn't want it badly enough. You self sabotage. The failure is always located in you, never in the protocol, never in the lack of real evidence, never in the fact that the advice was designed for a very specific body, life circumstance, health history that may have nothing to do with yours. For people who are already struggling with perfectionism, shame, and the belief that they are the problem, this is incredibly toxic. It doesn't just leave you frustrated, it can cause real psychological harm. I also want to name a pattern I see all the time. In a lot of online wellness spaces, aesthetic appearance becomes a substitute for genuine expertise. The more someone looks the part, the more credibility we unconsciously give them. Their body becomes the evidence that their advice works. That's dangerous. That's a dangerous inversion of how health expertise should work. So, how do you protect yourself without becoming cynical about wellness altogether? I like to offer few simple questions that you can ask whenever you're consuming wellness content. Question 1. What are this person's actual qualifications? A transformation story is not a credential. A large following is not a credential. Question number 2. Are they selling something? And if so, how directly is that shaping the advice? Question number 3. Does this advice make room for individual differences? Your hormones, your nervous system, your history, your life. Question number 4. When the protocol doesn't work, where do they locate the problem? Always in you, or sometimes in the method, or maybe systems that are blanket all wrong, such as the traditional healthcare system, all doctors are bad. Where are they placing their blame? Question number 5, and most importantly, how do you feel about yourself after you consume their content over time? Not just the adrenaline rush in the moment, but over weeks. Do you feel more empowered and compassionate with yourself, or more ashamed and defective? Real evidence-informed wellness will always acknowledge complexity. It will never promise that one approach works for everyone. It will not ask you to override your body's signals in the name of results. And it will not place the blame for every failure solely on your willpower, your consistency, or your character, or a system. If the wellness content you're consuming doesn't meet that standard, it's probably not serving your health, it's serving someone else's metrics. Okay, let's bring it all together now. Today we covered a lot of ground, and I want you to leave with 3 most important ideas. Number 1, change is a process, not an event, and the stages of change model tells us that most failure is actually just people being given the wrong tools for that actual stage. Be honest with yourself about where you are. That's not defeat, that's strategy. Number 2, your brain's resistance to change is not a character flaw. It's a feature of your neurology. The threat response, the ambivalence, your primal rewiring, all of it is normal and it can be worked with. Number 3, lasting change requires the body, not just the mind. Use the body check-in to listen to resistance and use other techniques. Even incorporating mindfulness can be so powerful. Here's your one action from today's episode. Just one. I want you to identify which stage of change you are currently in with something you've been wanting to change for a long time. Be honest. No judgment. Are you in contemplation, preparation? Maybe you have relapsed from action and you're figuring out your next move. Just name it, because naming it is the first step of working with it instead of against it. If this episode resonated with you, I would be so grateful if you would take 30 seconds to leave a review or a rating. It genuinely helps this podcast reach the people who need it the most. And if you know someone who is stuck in a cycle of, I know what I need to be doing, but I can't make myself do it, share this episode with them. It might be exactly what they need to hear. You might believe you don't have the time or energy to focus on yourself, but this is exactly the right time to get serious about your well-being. You don't have to do it all alone. I'm here to help. If you enjoyed this video and are ready to take the next step, head over to dramneshabir.com, where you'll find free resources you can access right away. The website link is below. Let's get started on your path to thriving.